Chapter 2. How many days? Complete darkness except for the rounds and an occasional ray of light between the door and the jamb. How many days alone with madness as pervasively present as a toad's feeble croaking? The beatings in the neighboring cells continued. Outside it was perhaps daylight, a real daylight full of trees and grass and zinc roofs, bluish in the morning light. Although his wife was in Prague, during the last 20 minutes he had felt certain that she was dead. Dead, while he was here, caged like an animal. He could see her face with its vague resemblance to a mulatto's, serene as are the faces of the dead. Her two full lips, slightly drawn, her waved hair straggling, her eyelids lowered over her large eyes, pale blue like a Siamese cat's, her whole face freed from suffering and joy, released from life. Even if he were victorious, he knew that upon his release he would go out into a world forever mutilated. He would bear this solitary death like a scar. And this alone showed him the power of that night which had him in its grasp, and the power of the enemy which was able to eject him from the world of men as though he were insane or dead. The guard's footsteps grew fainter, dully reverberating in the corridor, monotonous like all mortuary sounds. If I go round the cell 10 times before the second guard comes, they always followed each other at short intervals, she is still alive. He began to circle the cell. 2, 3, he bumped into the wall, miscalculating the distance. 4, I must not go so fast, I must keep the same pace. He knew that in spite of his limp, he was running. 6, the guard stepped. 7, 8, now he was running in the smallest possible circles, turning almost on the same spot. The guard passed. 9, he lay down on the floor. Lying down was forbidden. If I can count to 100 before they return, it means that she is alive. 1, 2, 3, silence. He closed his eyes and the numbers followed one another as before an execution. 60, 80, 98, 100, alive. He saw Anna's eyes open and opened his. While he was counting, he had unwittingly drawn his feet together, crossed his hands on his chest like a corpse. I'm already going mad, he thought. The steps of the guards, but he decided not to get up. He wanted to see a man. His courage, like all courage, was much better able to cope with danger than with terror. He had known this since a certain night he had spent in Siberia, in a village which the whites were hourly expected to surround. Terror had come over him, but when he had had the idea of opening the doors and windows of his hut, he had gone to sleep. The guards passed without opening the peephole. It's difficult to kill oneself beforehand here. I simply must think of some way. If I'm tortured, I may be lucky enough to have the strength to keep my mouth shut, but if I go mad, to have saved the list, only to reveal things that are 10 times more important, and perhaps one doesn't notice it. Perhaps one went mad by imperceptible degrees. And was he lucid at this very moment, seeking his wife's fate in numbers, as he lay stretched out in the posture of the dead? A guard came back into the corridor, humming. Music! There was nothing around him, nothing but a geometric hollow in the enormous rock, and in this hole a bit of flesh awaiting torture. But in this hole there would be Russian songs and Bach and Beethoven. His memory was full of them. Slowly, compellingly, music was banishing insanity from his breast. Banishing insanity from his breast, his arms, his fingers, and from the cell. Gently it brushed over all his muscles, except those of his throat, which, like his open lower lip, was unusually sensitive. Although he did not sing, merely remembered. Subdued at first, gradually released, and at last soaring free. The imaginary sounds recaptured the emotions of love and childhood, the emotions which seemed to concentrate man's whole being in his throat. Cries, sobs, and outbursts of panic, in the silence which surrounded Kastner like the lull before a storm. Over his imprisonment and his madness, over his dead wife, his dead child, his dead friends, over all the people possessed by terror, man's joy and grief rose in a mute paean. He closed his eyes. Uneasy waves, torpid like his wounds, began to stir in the depth of his consciousness, and little by little the solemnity of the deep began to settle over them. Then, as if the whole vast forest of sound had bowed at the mere motion of a hand, the chant fell and suddenly rose again, straining at all his wounds, lifting him like a ship to the very crest of suffering. This is the burst of music which is always the call of love. And beneath the pain, madness lay waiting, ambushed in his members, like the pain itself since he had stopped moving. He had been obsessed by the nightmare of a vulture shut up with him in a cage, which with relentless blows of its pick-shaped beak was tearing off pieces of his flesh, all the while staring greedily at his eyes. The vulture was coming, long swollen with the black blood of darkness, but music was the stronger. It possessed Kastner completely. He no longer possessed it. Snow in Gelsenkirchen, with a dog barking at a flock of wild ducks whose cries were almost inaudible in the muffling whiteness. Strike calls shouted through megaphones at the siren blasts from the mines, sunflowers mowed down in the guerrilla fighting, their yellow petals spattered with blood, winter over Mongolia blanched by a 3-day storm, rose petals shriveled like dead butterflies in the yellow wind, frogs croaking in the rainy dawn, with drenched palm trees, the distant horns of motor trucks still enveloped in darkness. Chinese merchants fleeing with their rattles before the red lancers and vanishing under the glowworms down an avenue of palms, the limitless expanse of the Yangtze flood and the wan moonlight, with piles of corpses caught in the crooked tree branches, and all those heads pressed against the cold earth, teeming with insects listening for the rumble of the white army on the horizon of the steppes or the Mongolian plains. And his youth, his suffering, his very will, all was vanishing, revolving in the motionless cadence of a constellation. The vulture and the prison cell were being submerged beneath a flooding death chant that enveloped all in a lasting communion, in which music perpetuated the whole past by liberating it from time, mingling all its manifestations even as life and death merge in the immobility of the starry sky. Fragments of war scenes, voices of women, shadows in flight, all memory was dissolving in an endless rain which fell over things as though it were sweeping them into the remotest reaches of the past. Perhaps death resembled this music, even here or in the guard room or in the dungeon at the moment when he was to be killed. Perhaps his life would stretch out before him thus, without violence, without hatred, wholly submerged in solemnity, and as his body was now enveloped by the darkness, as these shreds of memories were flooded by these sacred harmonies. Beyond the cell, beyond time, there was a world which triumphed even over suffering. A twilight world swept clear of primitive emotions in which all that had made up his life glided with the invincible movement of a cosmos in eternity. With the sensation he had had in dreams of soaring on outspread wings, he now felt his lean body mingling little by little with the boundless fatality of the stars, his whole being held spellbound by the army of the night careening towards eternity through the silence. He had a vision of the black sky of Mongolia spreading its canopy over the Tartar camel drivers prostrate in the dust of the Gobi Desert amid the fragrance of dried jasmine, the drone of their wailing chants punctuated by the nocturnal refrain. And if this night should be a night of destiny, may it be blessed until the coming of dawn. He struggled to his feet. While he remained motionless, his limbs and his flesh seemed to dissolve in the darkness. The aching parts, with their denser masses like knots in wood, only became localized when he moved. At the first step, he again became excruciatingly conscious of the structure of his body, of his bones and their throbbing joints, of his head, which was larger in the darkness than it had seemed in the light. Yet there was something more in music than the fatality of endless disintegration produced by sounds, causing man to sink, from serenity to serenity. To the abject domain of consolations, the music now issued forth a call that was echoed and re-echoed to infinity. In this insurgent valley of the Last Judgment, it seemed to bind in a common bond all the voices of that subterranean region in which music takes man's head between its hands and slowly lifts it towards human fellowship. It was the call of those who at this very hour were painting the red emblem and the call to vengeance on the houses of their murdered comrades, of those who were replacing the names on street signs with names of their tortured fellow workers, of those in Essen who had been beaten down with bludgeons and who, as they lay there limp like strangled men, their faces gory with the blood which streamed from their mouths and noses, because the SA men wanted them to sing the Internationale, had shouted the song with such fierce hope ringing in their voices that the non-commissioned officer had thrown his revolver and fired, had drawn his revolver and fired. Kastner, shaken by the song, felt himself reeling like a broken skeleton. These voices called forth relentlessly the memory of revolutionary songs rising from 100,000 throats, and no music is more exalting than a refrain pealed forth by a multitude. Their tunes scattered and then picked up again by the crowds like the rippling gusts of wind over fields of wheat stretched out to the far horizon, but already the imperious gravity of a new song seemed once more to absorb everything into an immense slumber. And in this calm, the music at last rose above its own heroic call as it rises above everything with its intertwined flames that soothe as they consume. Night fell on the universe, night in which men feel their kinship on the march or in the vast silence, the drifting night full of stars and friendship. Like his exhausted heart, it throbbed anxiously over his whole youth, over the mines on strike, over the fields of sleeping cattle, slowly awakened by dog barks re-echoing from farm to farm, and as the song completely subsided, the fervor of life and death just now united in the musical harmony was swallowed up in the world's limitless servitude. The stars would always follow the same course in that sky spangled with fatality, and those captive planets would forever turn in their captive immensity like the prisoners in this court, like himself in his cell. Then upon 3 repeated notes like peals of church bells, the first note bearing down upon all his wounds at once, the last shreds of the firmament receded to the depths of the world of anguish, and little by little assumed the form of a vulture. With his eyelids tightly shut, a slight fever in his hands that were now clutching his chest, he waited. There was nothing but the enormous rock on every side, and that other night, the dead night, he was pressed against the wall. Like a centipede, he reflected, listening to all this music born of his mind, which now gradually was withdrawing, ebbing away with the very sound of human happiness, leaving him stranded on the shore. Only a sly, submissive kind of subhuman creature grown utterly indifferent to time could adapt itself to the stone. Time, that black spider, swung back and forth in the cells of all the prisoners, as horrible and fascinating for them as it was for their comrades who were sentenced to die. For Kastner suffered less in the present than in an obsessing future, in a perpetual forever, which his absolute dependency in the closed door made more penetrating than the cold, the darkness, and the oppression of the stone. Something within him attempted to adapt itself, but the only adaptation possible was a state of stupor, a stupor broken by long musical phrases that lingered in the cell like stragglers. They were phrases of orthodox plain chants, their notes so prolonged that they seemed almost stationary, with all the obsessing force of the moment when he had decided to face arrest. They insistently called up the scene in the antiquarian shop with its Russian bric-a-brac and icons, stoles, chasubles, dalmatics, and crosses, and finally dissolved into nothingness. This struggle against stupor and the slow hours went on relentlessly at a tempo which was gradually decreasing. And Kastner would live through it here to infinity with those orthodox ornaments in the depth of his obsession, as if in the hold of a sunken galley. to a slower and slower rhythm, more and more drawn out like circles in the water, until all was nullified in the silence of complete mindlessness. Someone knocked. Was it at the cell door? He had been waiting for those knocks. Another knock. "Who is it?" he asked. Low voices beyond the door, matter-of-fact voices answered, "It is we." They had not come this time with arms outstretched, but as an impassive delegation sent by torture itself. Its voice heavy with death, but the tapping continued. 5 knocks, 2 more, and each knock brought Kastner back towards what was left of consciousness in the darkness of his cell. It was a prisoner who was tapping. 2 taps, a pause, and then 6 more, then a longer pause. No one had answered when he had knocked. Everything that resembled hope resembled madness. Was it not also madness to run away from all hope? Five taps, 2, 2, 6, 9, 10, 1, 4, 1, 4, 2, 6, 9. But it was already a hopeless jumble, and the intoning of those orthodox psalms persisted, a tomb chant over the treasure of a despoiled cathedral, confusing all the numbers. First of all, he must show that he was listening. He tapped. The other would answer and no doubt repeat his message. How could he write here in the cell? The other prisoner began again, more slowly this time. Oh, to be able to write, to write! Kastner felt like stamping with his foot, like a horse, when he heard the taps again. He wanted to accompany them with his whole body. But he would forget them nonetheless. I must think. But how could he think when he was permeated to the marrow by that intangible presence? By the menace of blows, by the frantic despair, betrayed by the faint sound of his chattering teeth. The other prisoner resumed his tapping. 5, 2, 2, 6, 9, 10, 1, 4, 1, 4, 2, 6, 9. And still the interminable chant. I wonder what it was that they used to call torture by hope. If Kastner were in turn to tap out a message, perhaps the other could make out what he had said. But how would he prepare an alphabet? The taps were about to begin again. He made one of the greatest efforts of his life to think. He could not drive from his mind the image of a hand vainly trying to catch a fly on the wing. He managed, however, to note that the other struck 13 figures. If I added them up to a single number, I might perhaps remember it. No, too long. If I cut it in 2, perhaps. Silence. He was waiting, hardly able to breathe, his whole body taut with agonizing suspense. He knocked at the wall again and again, at sheer random now, nothing. He had not grown deaf. He heard his own knocks, his steps, the whole muttering jumble of the prison sounds above the stubborn intoning. The guards had opened a nearby door. Had the one who was tapping just been caught or by chance simply taken from his cell? Like the music just now, hope was deserting him, was leaving him to the mercy of an annihilating stupor. Yet he continued to listen for the knock that would come. In vain, and once more hope ebbed. An illusory last time, like the illusory last spurt of blood expelled from a wound by the heart's irrepressible pulsation. He shut his eyes, and the dimly glowing world of half-sleep settled upon him, a jumble of images through which first appeared an iridescence like that of oily water. Pink finally predominated, slashed by a crisscross of diagonal black streaks. Was it that river ford where the fish, asphyxiated by the shells of the whites, had streamed down upon the starving insurgents with their guns slung across their shoulders? The piles of pink-bellied fish catching the cold dawn's salmon-colored light. As if the sun had suddenly risen, this light turned golden and blended into the shapes of a profusion of sacerdotal jewelry like the antiquarians. Their jagged surfaces flickered to the strains of the ghostly chant like the tiny flames of icon lamps. And at the same time, they were the night lights of the Trans-Siberian, grounded like an ocean liner in the forest under the telegraph insulators. Civil War. His mind was hurtling in a dizzy race in pursuit of the images that sustained his life. He must try to organize this race to bring it under the control of his will. When Bakunin was in prison, he would edit an entire imaginary newspaper every day. The editorial, news, fiction, literary articles, society gossip. The fleeting images evoked by the music had been merely spectacles. He must bring them into the realm of time. The whole problem of captivity was to cease to be passive. Perhaps Kastner would be able to overcome the stupor, the madness, and the obsession of escape that composed his subterranean life as the hope of heaven sustains the Christian through a life of sin. There was still as much strength within him as there was menace around him.